Think you could do this job? Most people will break under the pressure, but every day, air medical pilots launch into life or death situations without hesitation. Today, we're going behind the scenes to find out what it really takes. Welcome to Aviation Intrigue.
This is aviation intrigue.
Joining us today is Jason Quisling, Senior Vice President of Flight Operations and Aircom at Air Methods, a large U.S.-based air medical provider operating helicopters and airplanes. Jason, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Elaine. It's great to be here.
So with air medical flights, especially those that people might see on the news with helicopters coming to take people to the emergency department via helicopter, we don't really see a lot about what goes on behind the scenes of those missions. So today we'd like you to tell us a little bit more about what those air medical missions are like when it comes to helicopters.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It is a very complex operation that's really designed to help move the sickest people with very traumatic injuries or very serious illnesses to the hospital. And we have very highly trained pilots and clinicians behind the scenes that do a lot of work before the phone ever rings so that they're available on a moment's notice to go out to an accident scene or also go to a hospital and maybe pick up a very sick patient that needs to go to a higher level of care or a hospital with a specialty unit. And we find a way to transport these very sick, unstable patients in a matter of minutes, most often, and sometimes for very long distances in helicopters and airplanes.
Is there such a thing called a typical mission, or is every mission different? So, if you were to describe what a typical mission looks like, what would it be?
Yeah, so I would say that we have maybe like 3 or 4 buckets that kind of define the different types of missions that we do. Probably the most common is what we refer to as an interfacility transport. So this is where we're moving very sick or unstable patients from one hospital to the next. Usually this is moving from a hospital that doesn't have as many resources or maybe doesn't have specialists, taking that patient to a place where they can receive care that will, quite frankly, save their life oftentimes, and then allow them to return back into the community and have a long, productive life afterwards. A second category would be what we call scene flights. And so this would be what you just mentioned, Elaine, where you think about the news story where the helicopter landed on the interstate for a major car accident, or there was a building explosion or a mass casualty incident, those kinds of things. We fly out, we land somewhere where nobody ever intended aircraft to land, and pick up the patient and then fly them to usually the nearest trauma center or a specialty hospital. There's another bucket that's a little bit smaller. A few times a year, it varies from year to year. We will also do disaster response frequently in the Southeast. We work with hospitals to deal with hurricanes before landfall. We'll go and take some of the sickest patients and evacuate them to other locations that are not going to be impacted by the storm. After the storm rolls through, if roads are destroyed or power's out or things like that, then we work with the hospitals to bring in supplies, food, water, generators, all kinds of things. We'll move people around from one campus to the other so that they can support the patients. And then we'll also fly patients in and out of the hospitals, especially when the ground ambulances can't be there. And then
That's an amazing variety.
Yeah, there's a wide range of things. It could be wildfires, floods, all kinds of scenarios, but it keeps it interesting. And the last thing that we do on a regular basis is really kind of broader support. So things that may not be quite as flashy, but we do a lot of outreach and education in the community. We do training with fire departments, police departments, Secret Service, and just make sure that when they need us, we know how to do that safely.
I think a lot of people might be surprised to hear that you're actually staged, ready to go in minutes, much like a fire department or where they're always on call. How many people do you have to actually launch a helicopter, let's say for an urgent situation or where something is maybe minutes away for the helicopter and further out for maybe vehicles? How many people do you actually need to get on that helicopter, and what are the crew roles in that case?
Yeah, absolutely. So the typical air medical team is going to consist of pilot and then 2 clinicians. The most common pairing that we have is a flight nurse as well as a flight paramedic. We do occasionally fly what we refer to as flight doctors. And the reason for flight in front of all of these things are they're the medical version of those titles that you always think about, but they've also undergone special training to know how to do that job in an aircraft, in a helicopter, how to be safe, how to deal with a very small space where they're doing all the things they might do in an intensive care unit or a surgical unit. And so that takes a lot of specialty training. And they are doing a lot of work on the front side so that they are ready to go when the phone rings. And typically, I would say for the majority of our 300 or so bases around the country, we would see the team airborne in probably less than 10 minutes when they're requested for a flight on average.
How many aircraft do you operate?
So we have a fleet of about 400 aircraft currently. Majority of those aircraft, about 370, give or take, are helicopters. And then we have a smaller fleet of about 35 fixed wing turboprop. These are our Pilatus aircraft. They're called the PC-12, and they help us with the longer distance flights around the country. So we have them spaced out a little bit further around the country. They also are able to fly in some of the weather conditions that maybe the helicopters can't fly in, because the airplane just has a little bit more performance and a little bit more in terms of equipment on it.
I'm very intrigued by something you said. Those of us who are pilots go through fairly rigorous training to become pilots. People who are doctors and nurses, they go through a rigorous training to become a doctor or a nurse. Now we are putting both of them together. They're not really pilots, but they need to know how to do their job in an airplane or a helicopter. Can you tell us a little bit about how do you train them? I mean, are there facilities to get them trained?
Yes, we have a very large centralized training facility at our headquarters. And everybody, no matter what position they might hold, everybody will start with a week at our headquarters where they go through what we call basic indoctrination. We cover kind of all of the regulatory and process procedure, operating procedure kind of information to make sure that everybody understands how we do certain things at Air Methods, how do we handle understanding the risk and manage that risk appropriately. But then we get into specialized training. As you mentioned, we have people from multiple disciplines. They're all high performing people. If you don't give them training, they may not work well as a team. So we have what we call air medical resource management training, where they focus a lot on how to communicate to each other in complex or dynamic environments, really make sure that we're using all of the brain power, all of the eyes, ears, and hands that are across the 3 to 4 people that might be on that team, make sure that we can be safe and successful for all of these flights. We do a class for all of the team on night vision goggles. When we fly in the helicopters, we spend a good majority of that time flying in kind of the visual world. In aviation, they call it VFR, for visual flight rules. We do also fly using the instruments, flying through clouds, and low visibility at times. But we have a wide range of helicopters in our fleet, and so not all of them have the same capabilities in that regard. And that means we have a lot of visual flying, and at least half of our operations occur at night because we are a 24-hour operation. So the night vision goggles really help us reduce risk. They allow the team to be able to see what's outside almost as if it was daylight, identify hazards, and make sure that we're operating the aircraft safely. But there has to be a lot of coordination there, right? So that's where training on communication comes in. And then both of our, interestingly enough, I think it's pretty common. People think about maybe airline pilots and they think about these big simulator boxes that they go and train in for these jets. We do something similar for the helicopters. We have full motion level D simulators that replicate the helicopters. Here in Denver at a simulation center, all of our pilots go through training there, receive flight and ground training on the aircraft they're flying. We have a small airport nearby that houses actual aircraft that they then go out and do additional training in before they get to their base. And then they'll receive a base orientation where they do training at that site in the aircraft they're flying for the remainder of their career often. The clinicians go through a very similar process. They actually have what we call human patient simulators. And so they will practice advanced techniques and procedures on these patients that are a simulator. And then after about 2 weeks of company training for the clinicians, they will go out to a base that we refer to as a preceptor base. And this is where they'll actually work for a period of time in a supervised or kind of process where they have a very experienced clinician with them, and they'll gradually get more and more responsibility until they reach a point where they're allowed to fly unsupervised, and they'll go to their permanent base assignment. So it's a process. For many people, it takes somewhere between 3 to 6 weeks to get through the entire process and start flying at a base. And I think we're really proud of our training because we measure it through several different kind of clinical quality scores, and we have some of the greatest patient outcomes in the industry. We do a lot of research and share that with the industry because we transport about 100,000 patients a year.
That is a complex and fascinating industry you're in. And I was curious about the mention of the human patient training, because we would like a little bit of a description on how the flight crews and the medical crews handle that inherent patient trauma. You can imagine not just was there a traumatic incident, but now they're loaded onto a noisy, windy helicopter, lights flashing, and it's night, and possibly the weather is bad. How are the crews trained to deal with that inherent trauma and helping that patient manage that transport that they need?
Yeah, this is a very difficult part of the job that our teams do. Is they'll be in these high stress kind of situations. Just in general, any kind of pre-hospital emergency care, for people, there are all the dynamics of your proximity and closeness to the actual patient. And then sometimes you may have family members nearby, right? So it can be a very chaotic, very emotional kind of experience. Sometimes it can be quite humorous, and other times it's terribly tragic. But we work through, essentially scenario-based training. So we're doing skills training, we're doing technical training, but we put that into actual scenarios that we have seen in our operations. Some of them common and sometimes they're unique, but all of them, have multiple lessons for the team to experience and learn and then debrief around. And so our instructors are very good at recreating a very realistic kind of scenario with the human patient simulators. They're actually in a room, and if you think of a white wall room, kind of like the Matrix or something, they have a command center on the other side of a two-way mirror, and you can turn that room into anything. You can make it a scene from a shopping mall. You can make it a scene out in the middle of the woods. You can make it into a hospital actual unit with a bed and nurses coming in and out, and the physician, right? And so it's very immersive kind of training. And then with the patient simulators, the instructor is actually able to interact with the team through the patient simulator. So they'll be in a separate room. They'll be talking, but their voice will be translated into a female mother about to give birth, or possibly a small pediatric patient, right? So we do a lot of that type of training to prepare people on how to handle these situations, how to make good decisions under stress. And then, we also have a lot of humor. Sometimes it's dark humor, but, laughing and smiling together is the best way to get through these really stressful situations. And that camaraderie as a team, I think, is a very important piece of what we do, not only in training, but then what they carry on at these base locations.
That is fascinating. To me, it's like very Star Trek-y, right? Like I'm envisioning the holodeck from the old Star Trek shows. But later on, we will get into how do you recruit and what kind of people you're looking for. We'll do that in the next segments. Would you pursue a high-risk, high-stress profession like this one? Let us know so we can find out how many people are cut out for something like this.
That was a great overview of the nuts and bolts of your job, and we'd like to get a little more detail about some stories, some challenging missions. Do you have any experiences that you may have experienced or another crew member experienced in particular that you'd like to share that would shed some more light on what these flights are like?
Yeah, absolutely, Elaine. This is a great question. It's also a really tough question for me. I've been flying for about 38 years, and there are so many of these flights are really a giant puzzle. If I go back to maybe one of my very first air ambulance missions, I think it kind of highlights how chaotic things can be, and also at the same time how you can find a little bit of humor in a really bad situation. I remember I was brand new to my air ambulance career, and I finally got that call where we were going on a scene flight. We were going to go out to an accident, and the blood pressure starts flowing because of the time constraints, and you're trying to figure out everything kind of in the moment as you're going through. And then as a pilot, at that time I was flying a twin engine helicopter, and it had a lot of advanced avionics, and so it just in general it takes a fair amount of time to get everything turned on and ready to go. And you're trying to do that and be in the air, in less than 10 minutes so that you're not wasting any time getting to the patient. And all of those things were going smoothly. And as we're flying out to the accident scene, the visibility was not fantastic. It was certainly well above minimums, but we had maybe about 4 or 5 miles visibility. And in in an aircraft, when you're moving at about 2 miles a minute and you're in a low altitude kind of environment, that's not a tremendous amount of time to see things and make decisions. And I had a flight nurse sitting in the seat next to me up front in the aircraft, and so I had briefed. I was asking the team to be scanning outside, looking for obstacles, let me know about anything that could be a problem, and they were doing their job perfectly. And this flight nurse was a little bit new, and so we're flying along, and kind of coming out of the mist, I could see a little bit of a structure, and it would turn out to be a radio tower that was maybe about 1,000 feet high, and we were a little bit higher than that, so there was really no danger that we were going to run into it. But just as I'm starting to see it, this very diligent flight nurse next to me, she just screams out, "Tower!" And the startle effect of having somebody, in the middle of a very kind of high concentration moment, scream that out. I think I had a small heart attack in the middle of the flight, but something we could laugh about later. And we're headed out to our accident scene. And we had been told by the people on scene that we were going out to get somebody who had fallen off of a rooftop, maybe 20, 30-foot fall and hit the ground. And so we had a kind of bias off of that information, a preconceived notion of what we were going to get. And as we got closer, I could see that, there was this house that was up on trailers that was being moved down a street. And that was the accident scene. And so we're doing a recon of that scene. We come into land, and I'm talking to the firefighters, and everything's very chaotic at the scene. And I'm asking them what happened. And they said, well, they were moving this house down the street, and they got to a section where there were power lines. And so one of the guys got up on the rooftop of the house, and he didn't have anything really close and available. So he used a chainsaw to kind of take the power lines and lift them up over the roof of the house. And in the process of doing that, then he got electrocuted, and that caused him to fall off the roof and end up on the ground. Right? And so the medical crew is getting the same story as they're assessing the patient, right? And so they're still dealing with somebody who fell, but now their entire way of thinking about how they're going to treat this patient, what they have to be concerned about, it all changes because you get the rest of the story, right? And so then we're working to load everybody up and get back in the helicopter. And of course, as we had come into land, the only place to land was kind of the front of this house in their front yard. And during the landing, we had noticed that there were just a lot of things in the front yard. And it turned out it was kind of a neighborhood garage sale kind of day. And so they had these card tables and all kinds of personal knickknacks on the tables. Unfortunately, when you land an aircraft that weighs about 9,000 pounds, we create a lot of air moving down. We call it rotor wash. And so during the landing, we had kind of scattered everything that was in that front yard in all different directions. And while we're dealing with the patient, then I'm also talking with a police officer and the homeowner and trying to work through. Obviously, they were very upset about what is happening, everything that has been knocked to the four corners of their yard. And so we get everybody calmed down. We finally get the patient in, and then we're able to take off and fly back to the hospital. And, about 10 minutes later, we have this person inside of a trauma center receiving care. And ultimately, they ended up being discharged and didn't have any long-lasting effects because they were able to get that medical care very quickly. It just kind of gives you a sense, I think, of how dynamic these situations are, how many things may be happening that are not even related necessarily to the patient. Those are the things that pilots are having to manage throughout the flight, just as much as they're managing the things they normally do, like weight and balance, fuel planning, weather, all of those things, right? So you're extremely busy while these flights are happening.
That is so fascinating. My heart is pounding just listening to that story. I'm so glad that the outcome was positive. That makes me wonder. I assume that you have a risk benefit analysis. There are places where you could not land a helicopter, maybe the weather, maybe the environment, whatever it is. Like in this case, you just mentioned with a yard sale that's going on. How do you do that? I mean, do you do that before? Is that the pre-flight planning where you decide, what, this is not something we could fly?
It's, I would say it starts with standard process. We have a safety management system that we use to cover all of our operations. And inside of that, specifically for the pilots, we have what we call a pre-flight risk analysis form that they fill out in addition to their performance planning. Excuse me. So in addition to that performance planning, they're doing this pre-flight risk analysis. And inside of that, or encapsulated in that form, are many of the areas that we know are regular routine risks to our operation. Each of those are assigned a score, and as they get done completing this form, then they have a sense of how much risk are they trying to mitigate for that particular flight. That, along with their mission planning, all goes to our operational control center, and the specialist in the operational control center will review each of those in real time with the pilot and essentially give them authorization. It's kind of a second set of eyes looking at this to say, does this really make sense what you're going to try and do here? Right. And if it's aligned with company policies and we feel the risk is appropriate, then they'll get approval to launch and they'll head out on that flight. Now, the tricky part is, I think for a good pilot, they have to remember that you never stop with kind of looking for hazards, assessing risk, and kind of updating where you are in the flight. So that's the starting point, and it gives them a foundation of things they need to be thinking about that they know. And then as you get further in the flight and you get more information, you have to take that new information, reanalyze how does that change your original plan, and where do we go from here? And we do have direct contact to the operational control center. We also have communication centers that are following these flights minute by minute. We have satellite tracking of the aircraft. We have both radio and sat phone communications with the aircraft in our centers. And we use these people on the ground as support people to help them. For example, if a pilot is concerned over the horizon, it looks like there's weather building, and they don't necessarily have a good picture of if something has changed, they can call the OCC. The Operational Control Center will take a look at that through some pretty high test, weather analysis tools, and then they'll give that information to the pilot to see if that changes the picture for them on how they're going to conduct that flight. Are they going to take a different route? Are they, maybe they even decide the weather has gotten too bad, they're going to have to abort the flight, and we're going to have to send a ground ambulance. So using those resources both in the air and on the ground, it's a continuous process to try and make sure that we're keeping that risk at an appropriate or an acceptable level.
You mentioned the possible plan to abort a mission. Or is there a certain average percentage you say where either the flight does not launch due to weather or landing conditions, or where you do have to turn back due to something unexpected?
Yeah, I think in a typical year, we'll see weather impact us about 20% of the time. So a lot of times those weather impacts, I would say the majority of them happen on the ground. The pilots get a request to fly somewhere. They look at the weather and they say, we just can't do that. It's either it doesn't meet the legal requirements or it's just not, the risk is too high. Now, in a portion of those flights, I think our team can't settle at a simple no. We have to think about, okay, well, the ask was to go directly from A to B, and there's a storm in the middle there that prevents that from happening. Do we have the option to fly 30 miles on one side or the other? Do we have the option to have a ground ambulance drive 20 miles to a location that we can fly to and meet them there, right? So there is a lot of work that's done to try and find a way to safely get to, yes, we can help you move this patient. But there are times where the storms are just too big and cover too much area for us to be able to use the helicopters or the airplanes.
Jason, I gotta admit, my knowledge of this is watching TV shows or disaster movies. And so I have this view of what you guys do. I now appreciate it so much what you're saying, but I'm sure common public have certain myths. So what are the common myths or misconceptions that they have about your industry, and what would you like them to know?
This is a great question. And I think, Elaine also mentioned, I think the majority of the public, like their concept, if they have one of air medical, is probably something that came from a news headline. And those tend to be two types of headlines. They're not very regular in terms of stories on the news, but they're very dramatic when they happen. One is some type of major incident, and the helicopter responds, and it causes a major disruption. You see it landing in the middle of the interstate and all the lanes are shut down or something like that, which is generally a positive story about moving a patient or somebody that really needed that help. And then there is on occasion an accident that takes place with a medical aircraft, and very tragic, but it's a headline grabbing thing that always makes the news. And I think when people only see us in that way and they don't understand what happens in the background and all of the training and effort that goes into risk management, you look at this job and everybody thinks, wow, those helicopters are really dangerous and this is a very risky job. And it's true, there are unique risks in what we do. There are unique risks in aviation, but they are things that we don't just throw ourselves out there and see what happens, right? There's a lot of intentional planning. Every year, our company is analyzing thousands of reports of operations and looking for ways on how do we get better. Where do we maybe have a gap that didn't exist before that we need to find a new way to mitigate and reduce the risk around? How do we ensure that when the phone rings, there's a safe way for us to go out and help these patients, help these hospital teams or first responders in the field, because they really need our services. So I think that's probably the one thing overall, is for people to understand that there are risks in what we do, but our team goes through a tremendous amount of training and planning to try and minimize that risk.
Thank you for sharing that. People do have an opinion based on, like we say, about watching TV shows. And now that we understand what goes on the underside of the planning, it sounds like there is risk, but then you mitigate it with proper planning, with attention to details, and then no-go decisions on the fly, literally.
Yeah, I would say, it's all relative, right? But anything that we do in life has a level of risk. I could cross the street without looking and be in the crosswalk and get hit by a car and be seriously injured, right? When we take a very complex machine up into the air, there's a lot going on to make that aircraft fly. And, there are things that can break or go wrong with the aircraft, but then there are many things that we can do to mitigate that issue and find a way to get safely back on the ground. And so we have to be very focused, very concentrated. We have to have high technical skills. We have to work well as a team. But like I said earlier, we're moving over 100,000 patients a year out of these very complex situations. And we have incredibly huge success rate at doing this safely. And I think all of my counterpart companies in the air medical industry, they're all working to do the same kinds of things we are. We actually meet collectively as a group and share incidents that have happened, talk about safety mitigations, best practices, right? So there's a tremendous effort that's happening day in and day out to make sure that we're doing this the right way, we're doing this the safest way possible. And those are the things that happen behind the curtain that people don't see, right? And that's why I have every confidence that when my teams go fly, if I go fly, if my family were to be on these aircraft, these are some of the safest flights that are happening. But there's always a risk out there, and we can't ever not be focused on what we're doing. We can't ever stop the planning piece of this and be thinking about, what if this happens? What do we do? That I think is the kind of tricky paradox that happens around this.
If you've been touched by Air Medical Services and comfortable sharing it, please do so. Our viewers would really appreciate hearing about it.
Jason, these are amazing, fascinating details about the job of the air medical flights, particularly on the helicopter side. And I think you mentioned you've got almost 4 decades, over 30 years in that field. Can you tell us a little bit about how you became a professional helicopter pilot, what your career path led you to your current role today?
Absolutely, Elaine. I don't know if you could say it was a particularly linear path to get there, but from the earliest memories I have as a kid, I've always been fascinated by aviation, pilots, astronauts. I mean, anything that went in the air, I was always interested in. And I was fortunate enough, we had a friend of the family that owned a small airplane. Early on, I think I might have been maybe 8 years old, and they invited us to an EAA pancake breakfast at a local airport, and they were giving free rides, and I got to go up in the back of a small airplane, and I was instantly hooked on kind of general aviation and flying. I think I spent the rest of the breakfast sneaking into the back of any aircraft that had a door open so I could get another ride. But I eventually, I think I started flight training around 16 or 17. and I got my private airplane license. I went to college and was considering what I was going to do with my life. And at the same time, I had also gone and gotten training to become an emergency medical technician. One of my jobs working through college was working on a local kind of a rural ambulance unit as an EMT, and got to experience kind of the clinical side of pre-hospital care and emergency response. And there were a few occasions where we actually called because our patients were hurt so bad, we called for the helicopter to come in and pick them up. And so I got to experience this kind of from the first responder side.
Wow.
It's a very unique experience. It's exciting, it's fun, it's rewarding, but probably the greatest thing as a first responder or pre-hospital, you don't have a tremendous amount that you can do from a clinical perspective with somebody who's really hurt. And so there's this massive sense of relief when the medical experts show up and they take that patient and it's no longer your responsibility, right? And so that had all kind of culminated in me thinking, I really want to do this as a career. And so after I graduated from college, I scraped together some money and went out and developed the certificates for commercial pilot, for instructor pilot, for flying on instruments. I got my ratings in helicopters and airplanes, and then moved on to work in flight instruction for a couple of years. I'm teaching people to fly helicopters, planes, multi-engine airplanes, aerobatics, anything that the company had. It was great fun. I learned a lot during that time. I had a good friend who was also an instructor, and we purchased a Cessna 150, a small two-seat plane, and had a side business where we would spot swordfish for commercial boats off the West Coast.
Wow.
It was, yeah, I mean, a very, very diverse, set of experiences. I made friends with a commercial helicopter pilot on the field where the flight school was. And his job was doing external load in helicopters, construction, using, we call it a sling load because there's a cable that attaches to the belly of the aircraft. And then you move telephone poles and air conditioning units and things, and you put them in very difficult spots. So I got to fly along with him and learn about the external load. And all of that was building experience and time that ultimately let me get to my first Part 135 or true commercial operations job. And that was in Alaska, which was an absolute dream. I did flight seeing tours there. I had one winter where I went over to Guam and did some commercial flying there in the tour industry and a little bit in utility. And then I came back to Alaska for a few years and did all of the other jobs, to oil and gas support, to oil rigs in the Cook Inlet and interior of Alaska. I worked with the Park Service, doing a variety of construction and law enforcement things. Did heli-skiing, which was an amazing experience and also a little bit terrifying at the same time. And all of these things, I mean, I think I was probably having the time of my life, but then I met a girl who was going to become my wife, and I figured it might be time that I get a more normal job. And I had always wanted to do that air ambulance thing. And one of the advantages of an air ambulance job is that you're generally based in one location. You work a set schedule. Now, you may work days or nights, but generally speaking, you get to return back to your house every night. And so that was kind of the impetus for me to move there. Now, I was a young pilot at the time. This was a very different kind of aviation industry back then. And even with 5,000 or 6,000 hours of flight experience, it was a difficult task to get one of these air medical jobs. They're far and few between, and they were, very high standards to get into them. But I think one of the important things, and I would stress this to any aspiring pilot, one of the things that's brought me success is that I made a lot of friends, and I developed a very large network of pilots and maintainers, during my time and at my various companies. And that really gave me the network to be able to have somebody who would open the door for me and let me get the interview and then let me prove that, I could do that job. So it all kind of came together and worked out well. And I ended up flying the line as an air ambulance pilot, doing the medical missions for about 7 years in the Midwest. And then I decided to move into the training department. I became a check pilot with the company and trained air ambulance pilots for nearly a decade before I went into management as an assistant chief pilot. director of operations, and now senior vice president for flight operations and communications.
Wow, what a fascinating story. You make us all look boring and mundane on a regular basis. I'm wondering, Jason, that people who even decide to become a pilot, some of us say, you know what, I'm just going to become a private pilot because I have a mission. Some of them say, no, I want to fly for an airline. Some of them say, no, I want to go to military. You already mentioned that you didn't follow a very linear pathways to where you are. But are there a set of people who this would be sort of the linear path, saying that, you know what, when I grow up, I want to be an air mission pilot?
So I think it's a little harder on the helicopter side. This is where the airlines have an advantage, and this is, whether you want to be a helicopter, airplane pilot with the airlines, whether you want to fly drones. I mean, I would say first off, you can't find a better time in history to want to go into aviation. There's so many opportunities right now, and when you look at the airlines, many of them now have programs where you have little or sometimes even no investment other than your time and commitment. They will pay for the training. They will put you through a process. And within 1 to 2 years, you have the opportunity to actually start flying in a regional airline. You're making money. It's a good job, and it has tremendous career potential. It's not for everybody, because there's a different routine, a different set of things that you think about in the airline world, and the lifestyle. Although it has perks and benefits, there are some people that don't like that, right? On the helicopter side, or the Part 135 kind of charter side of commercial aviation, whether it's helicopter or airplane, there are a lot of other options and things for people that maybe don't want to fall into the airline mold, but they love aviation. You can have incredibly rewarding careers. I think the difficulty is it's not as obvious as how do you get to that end goal that you want. And in helicopters, unfortunately, it's probably been the hardest out of all of them, because helicopter flying is sometimes 2-3 times more expensive than flying a fixed wing airplane. And so there's a tremendous financial barrier there that you have to figure out a way to get through. And then, in helicopters, you get your ratings where you're technically able to do some of these things, but then you need to build this experience in order to get these jobs. And many of the helicopter jobs want experience in order to hire you. So there's a little bit of a black hole there on how do you get that return on your investment, and how do you get to that end goal. And that's something that I think, myself, my company, many other companies, we're talking about on a regular basis now. I've just started a program inside of our company that is working with very low time pilots, working with brand new flight instructors that maybe have 200 to 500 hours of experience. And we're bringing them in, and we're putting them through a process where they see what the 135, the commercial pilots, go through for indoctrination. They're getting a little bit of experience sitting through a single pilot instrument flying course. They're going into the simulator and they're shadowing a Part 135 check pilot. And how do they do their instruction? How do they teach their pilots what's important? And then we also give them some time in the full motion simulator where we put them through some of the most critical emergencies that are likely to happen to anybody that might fly, inadvertently going into the clouds and losing a sight of the horizon or your bearings. How do you handle that kind of a transition in an emergency situation? Engine failures, decision making. So the goal that we're trying to do is we're working with flight schools, we're working with tour companies, kind of these groups that are the in-between for us to get a new pilot, gain experience, and then be able to hire them in the air medical world. But we're starting at the very beginning when they're young and early, and we're trying to show them and connect them with the people that will help them get through that middle piece, and that they can not only build experience, but they can also build solid fundamentals around decision making, risk management, and they can get exposed to our company and see how cool it is behind the curtain, how much stuff happens and what this job really entails, right? So that we can keep them motivated, and hopefully within a couple of years, we reach a point where they can come interview for us and we know them. So it's a very easy process. We can hire them quickly and get them on the line. So working very hard to try and kind of build out that sequence, which I think has been missing from the helicopter side of the aviation industry for some time.
Is that because it is considered a real specialty part of aviation? As Gopal and I are airplane pilots, so we're just fascinated with helicopters because there's a lot of a gap there between the fixed wing and the rotorcraft worlds. And so I'm wondering if somebody came along and had maybe gone to a flight school and has a commercial airplane certificate, is it easier or harder for them to transition into the helicopter world? Let's say they started on that airplane path and decided, oh, that does sound interesting, or oh, I just discovered this. Does that help in terms of getting the experience, or would you say someone starting fresh in the helicopter world is more of an advantage in getting to do those complicated types of jobs like the medical transport?
Yeah, this is a question I hear a lot from aspiring pilots, and I would say, first and foremost, I think if you have an open mind and you're ready to learn, like there is no downside to doing any kind of training or getting any kind of ratings. I think there's a tremendous amount you learn. I started in airplanes, and I knew early on I wanted to fly helicopters, and it was a challenge to be able to figure out how to do that. But I was determined and found a way to make it all happen. It is, in terms of skills, there are some very distinct differences in how you operate the aircraft and things you have to think about. And it is generally easier for somebody to go from flying helicopters and learn how to fly an airplane than it is to go from an airplane to flying helicopters. The helicopter just has less overall stability, and you have to understand aerodynamics in a different way and approach them in a different way. Airplanes make flying a little bit easier because of their stability. And so those are kind of the things, but there's not really a wrong way to approach that. And I think either one could be beneficial. The only negative in there is cost. A lot of people starting out early trying to get to a career, they're not going to have a lot of money laying around that they can just afford to spend on one thing or the other. And so that's where sometimes it makes sense to blend, but other times it may make sense to be dedicated to one first, get that first job, and, start getting some money to start getting your return on investment. And then you have opportunities to start adding those other skills and giving yourself flexibility. A huge advantage of knowing how to fly both is that opens the doors to a lot of opportunities. So if you find a downside in one part of the industry for a year or two, you may have another window that's open where you can still go exercise your aviation skills in a different way and continue to be employed, right? So I think there are pros and cons there, but you have to weigh kind of the overall cost and how's that going to impact.
Jason, thank you for sharing that, both your story and the career part of it. I don't know if it's a fair question, but what is the most interesting part, enjoyable part of the job is for you personally, and what is maybe the things that you wish were different?
Yeah, so I'll just say, and I think this is true of many people that get into aviation at any level, it gets in your blood quickly, right? I love flying. I mean, um, helicopters above all else are my favorite because there's really a kind of a amazing experience to be able to have a machine like that sit in a hover and kind of float in the air, to be able to take something that might weigh 6 or 9 or 12,000 pounds, maybe even more, and bring it to the ground and set the landing gear down within an inch or two of where you want it to land. That's just an amazing experience, just like landing in a backyard, landing on a rooftop, being able to fly to the back of a boat. These are things that a lot of pilots just don't ever experience. But I would say that, there's not a day that goes by that I'm not incredibly thankful for all of the experiences I've had while flying. It's not just the aircraft itself, but it's, seeing the sun come up for that perfect sunrise, or watching it go down for a perfect sunset. And then the places where you might do it, I've had a chance to be paid to fly while I'm in Alaska and looking at the northern lights as we're heading out to an oil rig in the middle of the night. Or I've gotten a chance to fly in Guam and be looking at World War II wrecks in the ocean as a school of manta rays go by underneath. Or shooting an ILS into Andrews Air Force Base and being able to land there because we're an air medical aircraft, and we can train, at these restricted areas. So there are all of these amazing experiences I've been fortunate enough to be able to do all over the country and see, all while I'm getting paid to exercise my professional skills and get better at it, right? And then you couple that with, in the air medical world, getting to work with these amazing clinical teams and all that they bring to the table. And, you just end up inside a community that is full of really incredible people. Some of them are humble legends. Some of them are everyday Joes, but they have amazing stories. And I wouldn't trade that for the world. I think that over the course of my career, I've really become an executive. I run a flight department that has about 1,200 pilots. We have about 600 maintainers. And I spend a good part of my day in a very challenging environment that's also rewarding because I'm trying to figure out how to support these people and keep our operation running and stay safe and find new ways to service the community. But there are also the kind of typical things that you would find in any job. Mine are maybe a little more expensive kind of, headaches that happen, like a pilot misjudged the distance between the edge of the hangar and the rotor blade and backed the aircraft into that, and or he may have hot started an engine and that's $1.5 million that now we have to figure out how we're going to get the aircraft back in service and also make sure it doesn't impact the company, right? So those are the things that I spend a good portion of my day doing. And the only negative around that is I'd love to be flying, finding a way to get more time back in my life away from my day job, so to speak, and being able to do more actually on the flight deck of an aircraft. That would be probably the only thing I would change. But this industry has been an amazing journey for me over my career, and it's given me access to people and experiences that are truly unique. I would probably just close with a statement to any aspiring pilots. Probably the most important thing to remember is always stay curious, work hard, and most importantly, be kind. You never know who the people you're going to meet, how they're going to influence your future. And, little kindness goes a long ways.
Please take a moment to drop 8 thanks and gratitude to these brave people who fly these air medical missions. It'll be an honor to pass it along to Jason and his colleagues.